5 $1 bills, soft as old cloth from being folded and unfolded across a week of deciding, passed from her hand into the calloused palm of a man who did not want to touch them. Delia Rourke counted them out slow, one at a time, on the tailgate of a rusted stock trailer parked at the far edge of the Coldwater Junction sale barn, and the man taking them, a hauler named Otho Pring, who wanted only to be rid of what he carried, looked at those bills the way a person looks at a bad tooth. Behind him, packed into wire crates stacked 3 high, were 200 hens that had stopped being worth anything to anyone. They were molted half bare, their combs gone pale, their feet crusted, and they had quit laying somewhere back in the heat of August. Otho had hauled them from a failed operation 2 counties over and could not sell them for meat because they were too lean and too old, and could not sell them for eggs because they gave none. And so when the girl in the mud-stiff canvas coat asked what he'd take for the whole lot, he said $5 mostly as a joke and mostly to make her go away. She did not go away. She counted the money onto the tailgate, and then she stood looking at the crates for a long time without saying anything, which unsettled the men gathered near the loading chute more than any bargaining would have. There were 4 or 5 of them, feed store regulars and small landholders, who came to the Thursday auction to trade cattle and complaints in about equal measure, and they watched her the way you watch someone do something you have already decided is foolish. One of them, a broad man named Coy Eldridge, who ran the biggest tillage acreage in the valley and liked to be right out loud, said, plain enough for her to hear, that a smart girl would have kept her $5 for gas home. Winter was coming down out of the Wallowa country early that year. Everyone could feel it in the metal of the morning, and 200 spent hens going into a cold season was 200 mouths and no return. She's buying herself a grave to dig come January, Coy said, and the men agreed the way men agree when agreement costs them nothing. If you have ever been told that the thing in your hands, or the thing in your heart, or the patch of ground you were handed isn't worth the trouble, do me a small favor before we go on. Tap that like button so this story finds other people who've heard those same words. And tell me down in the comments where you're watching from, your town, your city, the crossroads nearest your house, because I read every one of them, and I like knowing who's out there listening. Then stay with me, because what Coy Eldridge said that morning was the exact thing this whole story spends itself proving wrong, and it starts with a girl and 200 birds nobody wanted. On the edge of a hard winter, in a corner of eastern Oregon most maps get lazy about. Delia Rourke was 22 that autumn, and she had come back to the valley in September, not because she had a plan, but because there was nowhere left that felt like it had a claim on her. Her mother had died the spring before in a rented duplex outside Boise, quietly, the way she'd done most things, and after the small arrangements were made and the few boxes sorted, Delia found herself holding the deed to a place she had visited only twice as a child. It was her grandmother's ground, 41 acres tucked against the base of a ridge along a gravel spur called Sarvis Creek Road, and her grandmother, Iva Meacham, was still living on it at 86, alone, having outlasted a husband, 2 droughts, 1 fire, and every prediction anyone had ever made about her. The place had come down through Iva, but the deed had been quietly put in Delia's name years back, a thing the old woman had done without ceremony and without telling anyone why. And now the girl had come to live on it because living cost less than paying rent on grief. The farm had gone dormant in the way old farms do when the hands that work them get tired faster than the land does. There was a barn with a sway-backed roofline and a milk house that hadn't held milk in 30 years. A windbreak of black locust her grandfather had set out as switches before the war, a spring that ran cold and steady out of the ridge no matter what the weather did, and pastures gone to cheat grass and thistle where cattle used to be. Iva kept a garden and a dozen hens and a wood stove and not much else, and she moved through her days with an economy that looked like slowness until you noticed she never wasted a single motion. She wore the same brown duck coat and rubber boots every day of the cold months, and she wore them without any self-consciousness at all, because she had earned the right to wear whatever kept her warm, and she regarded her granddaughter's arrival the way she regarded weather, as something to be neither welcomed nor resisted, but simply accounted for. They did not talk much those first weeks. Delia fixed a leaning fence post because it was leaning and split wood because the pile was low, and Iva led her, watching from the porch with a cup of chicory coffee going cold in her hands. The girl had a way about her that the old woman recognized, a habit of standing still in front of a broken thing and looking at it a long time before she touched it, turning it over in her mind. And Iva had known exactly one other person in her life who did that, and he had been dead for 11 years, and his name had been Alton Meacham, her husband, and he had built half of everything on that place with his hands and left the other half unfinished in a way that still ached. So when Delia came up the road in the borrowed truck that Thursday with 200 spent hens crated in the bed and $5 poorer than she'd left, Eva came off the porch and walked the length of the truck slow, looking, and said only, "You'll want the milk house. It's got the drain." And then she went back inside and put more water on the stove. The girl did not know yet why she had bought them. She would tell people later, when they asked, that she had looked at those 200 hens standing spent and shivering in their crates, and had seen not the end of something but the middle of it. Birds that had been worked hard and fed cheap and given no rest. Birds whose bodies had simply shut the laying down to survive. And she had thought, plain as anything, that a body that shuts down to survive is not a body that's finished. It's a body that's waiting. She didn't have the words for it that first day. She just had the feeling, and $5, and a milk house with a drain. She unloaded them one crate at a time as the light went flat and gray, carrying them into the old whitewashed room and setting the birds loose on a floor she'd spread with the last of the summer straw. And they stood there dazed, 200 of them, blinking in the dimness, not one of them worth a nickel to a soul in Coldwater Junction. She hauled water from the spring in a galvanized pail until her shoulders burned, and she scattered what cracked corn Iva had in the bin, and she sat on an overturned bucket in the doorway and watched them peck at it, and that was the first night. Coy Eldridge, if you had asked him, would have bet the whole thing was over before Christmas. Iva Meacham was not a woman who explained herself, and she was not a woman who gave a speech, and if she had a philosophy, she kept it the way she kept her money, folded small and out of sight. But she watched the girl feed those hens cracked corn for 3 days, and on the 4th morning she came into the milk house with a coffee can full of something dark and crumbling that she set down on the workbench without a word. Delia looked in it. It was ground eggshell and dried nettle and something else, oyster grit maybe, and bits of what looked like dried liver, all of it broken fine. "What's this?" Delia said, and Iva said, "Alton fed his birds off the land, not off a sack." Then she stood a moment looking at the hens, at their bare patches and their pale combs, and she said the thing that Delia would write in the back of the notebook that night and would go back to reading all through the winter and into the spring and for years after that. "A hen isn't a machine that wore out," Iva said. "She's a garden that got planted wrong." And then she went to see about the stove, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. Delia went looking for what her grandfather had known. She found it in the loft of the barn, in a cedar chest that had gone silver with dust, under a folded horse blanket and a box of rusted harness rings, a stack of composition books with marbled covers, and Alton Meacham's cramped pencil hand filling every page. He had kept records the way some men keep faith, daily and without fail, and the books ran back 40 years. Weather, what the cows did, what the garden gave, and in a run of 3 books she pulled out and could not put down everything he had ever learned about hens, which turned out to be a great deal, because Alton Meacham had believed, against every piece of advice the county extension office and the feed dealers ever gave him, that a laying hen was the most misunderstood animal on any farm, that she was not a factory to be run flat out and discarded, but a creature whose whole self, feather and yolk and flavor, came out of what she ate and where she walked and how much sun and rest and green she got. He had fed his birds on pasture and kitchen scrap and things he grew on purpose to feed them, comfrey and amaranth and a strip of clover he cut fresh, and he had written down the exact color of the yolks he got, orange going on red, and he had written, in the margin of one page, in a hand that had pressed hard enough to nearly tear the paper, "They laugh at the price of doing it right until they taste the difference. Then they stop laughing." She read that line by lantern light, and she felt something settle into place in her chest, like a bone going back into joint. The next morning she started over. She turned the spent hens out of the milk house into a bare paddock behind the barn, moved them onto ground for the first time in their lives, and she began to feed them the way the composition book said to feed them, which meant she began to grow their feed as much as buy it, which meant that the work stopped being about the hens alone and became about the whole 41 acres, and what could be coaxed out of dormant ground even with winter coming. It was slow. It was slower than slow. The hens, released onto dirt, did not know what to do with themselves at first, having spent their lives on wire, and they huddled by the fence and would not scratch, and Delia had to scatter feed wider and wider each day to teach their bodies to move, to walk, to peck at what grew. Iva watched this over the paddock rail with her hands in her coat pockets and said, without turning her head, they forgot they were chickens. Give them the winter, they'll remember. And they did. By the middle of November, the first of them had begun to put feathers back on, glossy new ones coming in dark and clean over the bare gray skin. And by December, when the snow came down and stayed, Delia carried warm mash out to them through the drifts twice a day, and noticed that a handful of the youngest birds had started, quietly, without any fuss at all, to lay. The first egg she found in the straw of the reconverted milk house nesting boxes on a gray morning near the winter solstice, and she picked it up and held it, and it was small, and it was warm, and the shell was the color of weak tea, and when she cracked it into a white saucer to look, the yolk stood up tall, and it was the color Alton had written about, orange going on toward red, a color she had never once seen come out of a store egg in her life. She stood in the cold milk house looking at that single yolk in the saucer for a long while, the way she looked at things, and then she carried the saucer up to the house and set it in front of her grandmother without a word. Iva looked at it. She looked at it a good long time. Then she said, "That's Alton's yolk. I haven't seen that color since he passed." And her voice did something on the last word that it did not usually do, and she got up and put more wood in the stove that did not need more wood. And Delia understood that she had been given a kind of blessing, and that the old woman was not going to say anything else about it, and that was all right. By January, the paddock birds were laying in real numbers, 40 and 50 eggs a day and climbing, birds that a hauler had all but paid to be rid of 6 weeks before, and Delia had more eggs than 2 people could eat, and no notion yet of what to do with them beyond the certain knowledge that they were good, that they were better than good, that they were something people had forgotten existed. She had never sold anything to anyone in her life, but there was a general store in Coldwater Junction, a low clapboard building with a bench out front and a hand-lettered sign, run by a widow named Selma Potate, who knew everyone's business because everyone told her their business while they waited for their mail. And it was Selma, more than any advertisement, who was about to become the reason a girl's rescued hens fed a town. Delia carried in a dozen eggs one cold Tuesday, cradled in a basket, and set them on the counter and said, "Plain, I've got extra. I'll trade you or sell you, whatever's easier." And Selma, who had seen every kind of hopeful thing carried through her door, and most of it come to nothing, cracked one open onto the flat of the griddle she kept hot for her own lunch, and she watched that orange yolk sit up proud on the iron. And she went quiet the way people went quiet around those eggs, and then she said, "How many can you bring me?" Selma Poteet sold that first dozen out of the case by noon, mostly because she made a point of frying one for anyone who came in and doubted her, and doubt did not survive contact with the pan. She put out a little wooden sign that said, "Meacham Place Eggs, Brown," and under it in smaller letters she wrote "Fed off the ground," because that was how Delia had described them, and it stuck. Word moved the way it moves in a small valley, which is to say it moved through kitchens and over fences and across the tailgates of trucks idling at the four-way. And by February, the demand had outrun the 200 rescued hens' slow return to laying. And Delia was rationing dozens, telling people she'd have more come spring when the whole flock was back on its feet, keeping a waiting list in the back of the same marbled composition book where she copied out her grandfather's feed formulas. She had never once run an advertisement. She had never printed a card. She had done nothing but feed spent hens the way a dead man's notebooks told her to, and let the eggs be what they were, and the eggs did the rest. Not everyone came around. Coy Eldridge came into Selma's one afternoon for chewing tobacco and stamps, and saw the wooden sign and made a sound in his throat. And Selma, who did not care for Coy, slid a fried egg across the counter to him uninvited on a paper napkin, and he ate it because it was free. And then he ate the whole thing without saying anything. And then he said, "Well, that's a fine enough egg, but a fine egg's a hobby, not a living." And he wiped his mouth and paid for his tobacco and went out. And that was the moment, though nobody in the store knew it yet, that the thesis of the whole thing got said out loud by the man best positioned to be wrong about it. Because a fine egg's a hobby, not a living, was exactly what Coy Eldridge believed with his whole conventional heart. And it was exactly what the coming year was going to take apart in front of him 1 dozen at a time. Delia, when Selma told her what he'd said, did not argue. She wrote it down. She had started writing down the things people predicted, not out of spite but out of the same instinct that made her keep the feed formulas, a sense that the words would be worth reading later in a different light. March came in wet, and the ground softened, and Delia did the thing that scaled the operation. And it is worth understanding that she did not scale it the way a man like Coy would have scaled it, with a loan against the land and a metal building and a truckload of birds bought all at once. She scaled it the way her grandfather had built the farm, the same way she did everything, which was to say by patience and not by debt. She let the demand pull the growth instead of pushing growth at the demand. When the waiting list at Selma's got long enough that people were leaving their names twice, she set 200 of her own eggs under the broodiest of the recovered hens, and in the incubator she'd bought second-hand with egg money, and she hatched her own replacements and additions rather than buying a flock, because a bird raised on her ground from the shell out would be a better bird than any she could buy. Alton's notebook said so, and by now she trusted the notebooks more than she trusted the men at the feed store. She planted the feed crops in April, the comfrey and the amaranth, and a long strip of clover and chicory, turning the dormant pastures her grandfather had loved back toward the use he'd loved them for, and the 41 acres that Coy Eldridge had called a grave to dig began, quietly, to come alive under a girl's steady hands. The original 200, the spent hens, the worthless ones, came fully back into lay that spring, every one that had survived the winter, and they laid like they were making up for a stolen life, and their eggs were the best of the lot because they were the oldest and had the most pasture in them, and Delia never sold those particular birds' eggs without a small private feeling she never spoke about, a feeling that they had, all of them, girl and hens both, been counted out and folded away and set on a tailgate for $5, and had turned out to be worth a great deal more than the price anyone would name. She kept a running tally in the composition book. In April, she sold 312 dozen. In May, she sold 540. The money was not large, but it was real, and it was climbing, and it came in 1s and 5s and 10s from the hands of neighbors, the same denomination she had counted out to Otho Pring, coming back to her now folded soft and warm, and she paid Eva's property tax with it in May and did not make a ceremony of it, just laid the receipt on the kitchen table where the old woman would find it. And Iva looked at it and said nothing, and folded it into her Bible, which was where she kept the things she meant to keep. A boy named Rennick Cobb, 15, whose father worked the county road grader and whose family had more mouths than money, started coming around in April asking if she needed help, and she did. So she hired him for eggs first, and then for eggs and cash, and he turned out to have the same knack she did, the willingness to stand still and watch an animal until it told you something, and she taught him off the notebooks and he learned fast. Rennick became the second pair of hands that made spring possible, hauling the movable pens she'd built out of scrap lumber and welded wire across the fresh pasture on a rotation, following her grandfather's diagrams so that the hens grazed a strip and moved on, and the ground behind them came up greener for the manure, which was a thing Alton had drawn out in the margins of the third composition book with little arrows and dates, a system he'd worked out alone over years with no name for it that anyone in the valley used, though Delia would later learn the practice had a name in other places and cost people good money to be taught. She did not care what it was called. She cared that it worked, and it worked. And by June, the pasture that had been cheat grass and thistle in September was a moving green quilt of clover and chicory, with 200 and then 300 and then 400 glossy dark hens working across it in their scrap wood pens, and the eggs kept coming. And Selma Poteet's little wooden sign at the store had been joined by a second one because she'd run out of room to write. And the second one just said, "Ask about the eggs," and people asked. The thing that broke the operation open past the town was the chef. There was a woman named Marisol Van Trees who had left the valley 20 years back and made a life cooking in Portland and then come home the previous fall to open a small restaurant in the old bank building in Coldwater Junction, 12 tables, a place people had bet would fold by spring the way people bet against everything new. Marisol came into Selma's one morning for coffee and got the fried egg treatment like everyone else, and unlike everyone else she stood very still over the plate the way Delia stood still over broken things. And then she asked Selma who made this egg, and Selma told her. And Marisol drove out Sarvis Creek Road that same afternoon in a hatchback with city plates and found Delia in the pasture moving a pen with Rennick. She did not make small talk. She looked at the birds and the moving pens and the green coming up behind them, and she said, "I have cooked eggs on 4 continents, and I have not seen a yolk that color since I was a child eating at my great-grandmother's table in this valley. And I would like to buy every egg you can spare, and I would like to put your farm's name on my menu." And Delia looked at her a long moment and said, "You can have what the store doesn't take. The store comes first." And Marisol, who understood loyalty when she met it, said, "Fair," and shook her hand. What Marisol did that the town could not do on its own was carry the egg's reputation out past the valley's rim. People drove up from La Grande and Baker City, and once, memorably from as far as Boise, to eat at the little restaurant in the old bank, and what they came to eat, more than anything on the menu, was a simple plate of 2 eggs from the Meacham place cooked in butter, which Marisol charged almost nothing for and refused to fancy up, serving them plain on a warm plate the way she said they deserved to be served, and food writers came and wrote the word about them. And the word they used again and again, having no better one, was the word Selma had put on the first sign without knowing it would matter. And pretty soon, there were people who had never set foot in eastern Oregon who knew that somewhere out past the mountains a young woman was feeding rescued hens off the ground and getting eggs out of them that tasted like something the world had forgotten. Delia read some of it. She wrote none of it down. The prediction she saved, the praise she let pass through her, because Alton's notebook had a line for that too near the back that said, "Don't let the good word swell your head any more than the bad ones sink it. Feed the birds." And she fed the birds. By that second autumn, a year after the tailgate and the $5, the Meacham place ran near 1,000 hens across the rotated pasture, and Delia had money in the bank for the first time in her life, and had not borrowed $1 to get it. She had done it the way her grandfather did everything, small and steady, letting demand pull the growth, refusing the loans the bank in the old building's back office now offered her unasked, refusing the man who drove out from a regional grocery chain wanting to put Meacham Place eggs in 40 stores if she'd just take on debt and triple her flock inside a year. And she told that man no in the pasture without stopping her work, and he did not understand it, and he left annoyed, and she watched him go. And then she wrote in the composition book, the same book, the words the notebooks had taught her, which were that a thing grown too fast is a thing grown wrong, that a garden planted all at once by a man in a hurry gives him weeds. She would grow to what the land could carry and the birds could bear, and no faster. And if that meant turning away money, then she turned away money, and she slept fine. It was Coy Eldridge, in the end, who paid the story its due, and he did it the way such men do it, quietly and late, and without wanting a fuss made. He came out Sarvis Creek Road on a cold, bright morning that 2nd November, driving slow, and he parked his big truck by the barn and got out and stood at the pasture rail a while, watching the hens work the frosted clover. And Delia let him stand there because she had learned from her grandmother that some men need to be let alone with a thing before they can say what they came to say. After a good while, Coy said without turning, "I told Selma you were digging yourself a grave. She probably told you." Delia said, "She told me." Coy nodded slow and kept watching the birds. "My daddy kept hens like this," he said, "on the ground, fed them off the place. I remember the eggs. I forgot I remembered them until I ate one at Selma's." Then he was quiet again, and then he said the thing he had driven out to say, which was that he had 400 acres of tired ground. He'd been farming the same tired way for 30 years, and it wasn't given what it used to, and he'd been reading about what she did with the pins and the rotation, and he wondered, he said, he just wondered if she'd come look at it sometime and tell him if it could be brought back. He did not apologize in words. He offered her the ground to look at, which was the only apology a man like Coy knew how to make. And Delia understood that, and she said, "I'll come Thursday." And Coy said, "All right then," and got in his truck and drove off, and neither of them made a large production out of any of it. She kept the notebook going all that winter and into the 3rd spring, and the entries by then had thickened into something that was half ledger and half something else, half a record of a farm coming back and half a conversation with a dead man she had never really known. And there were mornings she caught herself writing to him, filling in a result he'd have wanted, noting a yolk color or a hatch rate the way you might tell your father a thing he'd have liked to hear. Iva was slowing that winter. The old woman had passed her 88th year, and the cold got into her worse than it used to, and she spent more of the day now by the stove, but she still came out to the pasture rail most afternoons, wrapped in the brown duck coat, and she still watched the hens with the same accounting stillness, and one afternoon in February, with the light going gold and low across 1,000 birds working the winter ride Delia had planted for green, Iva said, quiet. More to the birds than to the girl, he'd have liked to see this. He always said the ground would pay you back if you'd only feed it instead of mining it. Nobody listened to him. They're listening now. Delia stood beside her and did not answer, because there was nothing to add, and the two of them watched the light go until it was gone, and then they went in. Iva Meacham died in her sleep in the last week of March, in the 3rd spring, in her own bed in the house her husband had built, having lived long enough to see the ground he loved come all the way back, and the eggs he'd believed in feed the town that had laughed at both of them. There was no drama in it. She simply did not wake, and Delia found her in the morning, looking as though she had merely decided the work was done, and in a way it was. The whole valley came to the small graveside up on the ridge, more people than the family had seen together in years, and among them was Coy Eldridge in a black coat, and Marisol Van Trees, who closed the restaurant that day out of respect, and Selma Poteet, who had known Iva 60 years, and Rennick Cobb standing with his hat in his hands, having grown 3 inches in 2 years, and Otho Pring the hauler, who had heard, everyone had heard, and who came and stood at the back and did not say anything about $5 because he did not need to. They buried her beside Alton under the black locust her husband had set out as switches before the war, and Delia put no long words on the stone, only the name and the years and beneath them, because she had found it underlined twice in the last composition book and knew he had meant it for whoever came after, the line, "A garden that got planted wrong is still a garden." She had not understood until she carved it that her grandfather had been writing about more than hens. The farm was hers alone now, fully, the deed and the ground and the notebooks and the graves, and she did with it what she had done with everything, which was to keep on the same way, without ceremony, letting the thing pull its own growth. She went and looked at Coy Eldridge's tired 400 acres that first spring after Iva passed, and told him plain what she'd told the notebook, that ground doesn't come back fast, that he'd need 3 years of rotation and rest and things planted to feed the soil before it fed him. And Coy, who had spent his life wanting things fast, surprised the whole valley and himself by saying, all right, 3 years, and hiring Rennick Cobb half-time to run the pens across his acreage on Delia's diagrams, so that the practice Alton Meacham had worked out alone in the margins of a composition book, laughed at for 40 years, began to spread down the valley from farm to farm, not because anyone advertised it, but because it worked, and because people had eaten the proof of it fried on Selma's griddle and served plain on a warm plate in the old bank building. By the 5th year, there were 4 farms on Sarvis Creek Road, and the roads near it running hens on pasture the old way, and the eggs went out under their own names now, and Delia helped every one of them get started and took nothing for it but the satisfaction, because Alton's notebook had a line for that too, that knowledge hoarded rots like held grain, and knowledge given multiplies, and she had come to believe every word that man ever wrote. She never did get large. That was the thing the grocery man and the loan officers, and even, in time, some admiring strangers could never quite understand about her, that she had a thing everyone wanted, and she would not make more of it than her ground could make honestly, and she turned down more money in her 20s than most people in that valley saw in a decade, and she did it without any sense of sacrifice, because to Delia Rourke the point had never been the money. The point had been the yolk standing up orange in the white saucer. The point had been the spent birds putting their feathers back on through a hard winter. The point had been a girl who had nowhere to be, and a dead man's handwriting and 41 acres nobody thought were worth the trouble, all of it turning out to be worth exactly as much as patient attention could prove it worth, which was a great deal. She kept the milk house that had held the first 200 birds and never tore it down, and she kept, in a frame on its whitewashed wall, a single $1 bill, one of the 5, which she had gone back and asked Otho Pring to sell her out of his cash box a year later, and he had for $1, laughing, and she had framed it, and under it in her own hand on a card she wrote the price of a thing is not the same as its worth, which was the phrase that had grown up in her across those years the way the clover had grown up across the dead pasture, and she believed it the way she believed the notebooks, plainly and all the way down. The last of the original 200 hens, the spent birds, the worthless ones, lived far past any laying age, because Delia would not cull the ones that had started it all. And there was one in particular, a dark speckled hen with a crooked toe, that had been the very first to lay that solstice morning in the milk house, that lived 7 years and became something like the soul of the place, following Delia across the pasture in the evenings when she went to shut the pens, and Rennick had named her the widow because she'd outlasted every bird she came in with, and when the widow finally died, Delia buried her up on the ridge, not with the family. She wasn't foolish, but near enough, at the foot of the black locust, and she stood there a while in the way she had of standing still over things, and then she went back down to feed the birds, because there were always birds to feed, and that was the whole of the work and the whole of the point. Coy Eldridge's tired ground came back in the third year just as she'd said it would, and the first spring it gave him a real crop. Again he drove out to the Meekum place with a case of good whiskey in the truck bed that he set on the porch without knocking, and inside the case, tucked between the bottles, was a $5 bill folded soft and no note, and Delia found it and understood it and laughed out loud alone in the yard, which she rarely did, and she added that bill to the frame in the milk house so that there were two now, and she never told Coy she'd seen the joke, and he never asked, and that was exactly the size the whole thing was meant to be between two people who had learned the same lesson from opposite ends of it. If this story found you today because you needed it, then do the one thing I'll ask of you. Send it to somebody you know who has been told, in so many words, that the thing they're holding on to isn't worth the trouble, the little idea, the rundown place, the second chance nobody else can see the value in. Because there is somebody in your life right now who is standing still in front of a broken thing and getting laughed at for it, and this is the story they need. Then tell me down in the comments about the thing you were told wasn't worth it, and whether you kept it or let it go, because I want to know. And let me know what town or what crossroads you're watching from, near or far. Because I still like knowing who's out there in the dark, listening to a story about hens and patience and a girl who counted out 5 soft dollars on a tailgate while grown men laughed. I read every single comment that comes in, all of them, and I will read yours. Delia Rourke is out there yet, if you go looking, out past the mountains where the maps get lazy, on 41 acres along a gravel spur, feeding rescued birds off the ground the way a dead man's notebooks taught her, letting the yolk stand up orange in the saucer as proof that does not need to argue, and the town she fed still eats her eggs, and the men who laughed are the ones who spread her word now, and somewhere folded in a frame on a whitewashed wall are $2 bills that mean more than the sum a bank would count them. And that, in the end, is the only kind of vindication worth waiting a whole winter and a whole life for. The quiet kind, the kind that arrives without a sound and asks for nothing but that you go on feeding the birds. Years on, when the story had settled into the valley the way a good rain settles into worked ground, disappearing from the surface but showing up later in everything that grew, people who had not been there began to tell it. And they got parts of it wrong the way stories always drift, and Delia let them. She had stopped correcting anyone. She had learned that a story, like a hen, does better when you feed it and leave it alone. Some said she'd bought 1,000 birds that first day. Some said she'd paid nothing at all and won them in a bet. And one version that made its way back to her through a school teacher in Baker City had her hearing the hens crying from the highway and turning her truck around out of pure mercy, which she found so far from the plain truth of the tailgate and the folded fives that she almost wrote it in the notebook, and then didn't, because Iva had never wasted ink on foolishness, and neither would she. The notebooks themselves she kept in the cedar chest where she'd found Alton's, all of them together now. His and hers, 40 years of his cramped pencil and a decade and more of her own steadier hand, and it had come to matter to her that they sat in the same box because it made a single record of it, one continuous account of a family that had believed the same thing across a gap of death and been proven right on both sides of it. She added to hers most nights still, out of habit that had hardened into something closer to devotion, and she had noticed that her entries had begun, without her deciding it, to sound like his, the same terse confidence, the same trust in the ground, and once she caught herself writing a line she was sure she'd read in his book and went and checked and found she hadn't, that it was hers, that she'd come to the same words on her own by walking the same pasture he'd walked, and that felt less like copying than like inheritance completing itself. Rennick Cobb grew up and stayed. That was the thing Delia was proudest of, though she'd never have used the word. The boy who'd come around at 15 asking for work took over Coy's 400 acres outright when Coy got too old to farm them, running the whole spread the pasture way. And he married a girl from La Grande, and they had children who grew up thinking it was ordinary, entirely ordinary, that eggs had orange yolks, and that you moved the birds every few days and let the ground rest, having never known the valley when it believed otherwise. Delia would see those children sometimes at Selma's, sitting on the bench out front eating a fried egg on a paper napkin, swinging their legs, and she'd think that this was the real crop, this ease, this forgetting, this generation that had inherited the answer without ever having to fight the question. And if that meant her own hard winter would eventually be forgotten entirely, worn smooth into a thing everyone had simply always known, then that was fine. That was the point. That was how you knew a thing had truly taken root. Selma Poteet kept the store until she was past 80, and the two little wooden signs stayed in the window the whole time, faded near white, the letters gone ghostly. And when Selma finally sold the place to a young couple from out of the valley, she made them promise to keep the signs, and they did, though they can't have understood what they were keeping, and the eggs still moved through that counter, and somebody still fried one for anyone who doubted, because doubt still didn't survive the pan. It never had. Marisol Van Trees's restaurant in the old bank lasted, which surprised the people who'd bet against it and surprised no one who'd eaten there. And the plain plate of 2 eggs and butter stayed on the menu at almost no charge until the day she retired, a stubbornness she and Delia shared and never once discussed, the refusal to make a fine thing fancy or a cheap thing dear. When Marisol closed the place, she gave Delia the small hand-painted sign that had hung by the register all those years, the one that named the Meacham place, and Delia hung it in the milk house beside the framed dollars. And now there were 3 things on that whitewashed wall that told the whole story to anyone who knew how to read a wall. And Delia went on. That was all, in the end, that she ever did. The thing her grandmother had done, and her grandfather before that, she went on, morning and evening, through the winters that came early and the ones that came late, feeding rescued birds off the ground on 41 acres. Nobody had thought worth the trouble watching the yolk stand up orange as proof that argued with no one, growing only to what the land could honestly carry, refusing the debt and the hurry and the scale. And if you had asked her, on any of those ordinary evenings, whether it had all been worth the 5 soft dollars she'd counted onto a stranger's tailgate while grown men laughed, she'd have looked at you a long moment in the way she had, and then gone back to shutting the pens, which was answer enough, and always had been.